Welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Gabriella Busandri of Image Reality. We develop immersive collaborative software for the oil, gas and other industry. We're joined today by Peter Guttridge, who's a carbonate sedimentologist and director of Cambridge Carbonates. Welcome, Peter. Peter will be taking us through an overview of the Cretaceous sequence stratigraphy and Palaeogeographic geography of the Arabian Plate using our Stratbox desktop solution. And we look forward to enjoying this session with you this afternoon, Peter. Thank you. And to anybody who has joined us, please feel free to write any questions you might have in the section there that you have available to you. We will have a session at the end for Q&As that I will manage, and we will put those questions to Peter, so do feel free. We'll pick those up at the end. Thank you, Peter. Over to you.
Good afternoon from the UK. Thank you for attending, and I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year. The aim of this webinar is to look at the Cretaceous petroleum systems using our regional paleogeographical maps. Cambridge Carbonates has a suite of paleogeographic maps covering the productive area of the Arabian Plate, from the Zagros suture through to the Oman suture, and from northern Iraq to Oman and up onto the Arabian Shield. These are based on third order sequences, and although I'm presenting on the Cretaceous today, we have these maps at systems tract level for the whole of the Phanerozoic. I'm going to, later on in the webinar, I'm going to be showing you some high resolution maps, but the aim of this map is really just to show you the extent of the coverage. I want to focus on 4 case histories in carbonate and mixed carbonate plastic settings, and I will be presenting jointly with Image Reality a remote workshop on 5 half days from the 29th of January to the 2nd of February, where I'll be exploring these case histories in more detail and expanding on the Cretaceous petroleum systems of the Arabian Plate. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to our paleogeographic mapping and how it came about. In the early 1990s, Cambridge Carbonates was involved in a sequence stratigraphic study and paleogeographic mapping of the northern Iraq area. And during this period, we extended this stratigraphic scheme and mapping to all of Iraq. And in 2000, this resulted in a benchmark publication that is used throughout the industry, Arabian Plate sequence stratigraphy, which presents the basic correlation, sequence stratigraphic correlation on which our paleogeographic maps are based. And since then, up to the present, we are updating and extending our mapping and correlations to the Gulf states and also across to the Zagros suture. The way these maps are produced, these are based on a robust sequence stratigraphic framework based on the correlation of plate-wide third-order maximum flooding surfaces, labelled K10 to K190 for the Cretaceous interval. Now, we have extended this work, and we recognise many more maximum flooding surfaces and third-order sequences than originally presented in the Arabian Plate stratigraphy book. So we've been refining the scheme. It's based on published litho and chronostratigraphy, integrated with biostratigraphy and strontium isotope stratigraphy where we have it. And we recognise 30 Cretaceous third-order sequences, and for each sequences we have the low stand, transgressive, maximum flood and high stand systems tracks are defined, and we have maps for each of these. And each map is identified by the maximum flooding surface in which the third order sequence contains. And we also integrate published sedimentological information from outcrop, core, wells, logs, seismic geometries, and these are all posted on base maps. And also we undertake confidential studies where we integrate clients' confidential data into these maps. Those maps are not available for public sale and are available and are only produced at the client's request. Okay, so I'll now introduce the general Cretaceous plate tectonic setting for the Arabian Plate. Essentially, there's two phases of this can be split into two phases: a late Jurassic to late Cretaceous, where the Arabian Plate was sitting on the southern margin of the Neotethys Ocean, and during this time, the ocean was spreading, and the Arabian Plate formed part of essentially a passive continental margin throughout this time. And it was in the interior, we have the exposed Arabian shield, which was acting as a clastic source into across the continental margin. And we have a number of structurally controlled basins over the outer part of the continental margin, which also control sedimentation. From the late Cretaceous to the early Cenozoic, Neotethys began to close, and we changed from a passive continental margin into a convergent regime. And at this time, we begin to see evidence of ophiolite abduction along with what is now the Zagros suture and at the Oman margin. And also we begin to see evidence of clastic systems being shed off the convergent margin onto the Arabian Plate from the northeast direction, rather than from the Arabian Shield itself. The Cretaceous is thickest, up to 10 kilometers thick, along the Zagros suture and also along the Rub al Khali Oman Mountains axis, and it thins to zero mainly by onlap and by progressive erosion under various unconformities in a southwest direction towards the Arabian Shield. And there are major structurally controlled basement highs in the Fars province of Iran and also on the Hail Rutba Arch. So these are the main areas of sedimentation and the main controls on deposition throughout the Cretaceous. Now this produces the stratigraphical architecture of the Cretaceous, whereby you have these mainly carbonate with some clastic systems thinning and onlapping to the Arabian Shield to the southwest, and thickening and becoming more carbonate rich towards the continental margin to the east. And the Cretaceous comprises two megasequences, which have been labelled AP8 and AP9, and these are split into 6 supersequences, 1 through 6, separated by major unconformities. So these systems onlap the Arabian Shield to the west. From the Barremian to the Aptian, it is essentially a passive margin, and from Aptian Albion we see a change from south to north drift coinciding with the opening of the mid-Atlantic. So these major unconformities are attributed to these major tectonic events happening outside the Arabian Plate area, and also some of these are attributed to thermal doming events in the African Plate itself. So the unconformities are these major sedimentary sequences are really controlled by a combination of megatectonic events and more local thermal events. Now, if we start at the bottom, the framework for Cretaceous deposition really depends on the inherited geometry and subsidence patterns in the underlying Jurassic basins. This is a regional isopack facies for the Thamama group, which is the lower Cretaceous, and we have this includes megasequences AP8, 1 and 2, and the thickest is in the older Jurassic Basin in northeast Iraq and Luristan, and also in Oman, Abu Dhabi area. And we also see evidence of inherited north-south basement structures. For example, we have the Gawar structure, we have the Qatar Arch, and we have the Burgan High going through Kuwait. And these are all inherited structures from the basement that controlled sedimentation throughout the Cretaceous. So this is the general chronostratigraphic architecture we find within the Cretaceous. We have these mega sequences. We have periods during the early Cretaceous and the middle Cretaceous where we have major progradation of clastic systems from the Arabian Shield area. And between these, we have expansion of carbonate systems with associated intra-shelf basins over the Arabian Plate. Now, I want to talk you through this in terms of, I want to pick 4 main case histories at different stratigraphic levels throughout the Cretaceous. And then I'll finish off by looking at the, giving a general summary of the upper Cretaceous. So I want to start off with the Minigish oolite systems, which is the early Cretaceous, and we're looking at Variacean Valanginian sediments, mainly in a carbonate depositional system. So now I'm going to quit PowerPoint and go into Stratbox. So I can now zoom in on the paleogeographic maps to explain the symbology of them in a bit more detail. The green ornament represents oil fields. There's Burgan. The red ornament represents gas fields. And if we zoom in even more closely, you can see all the data points that we've posted on these maps to construct the paleogeography of these intervals. And also, you might notice these red numbers and letters, and those refer to actual published references, so that anybody using these can go back to the original reference if they want to verify something. Now, these are a series of maps for the sedimentary sequence containing the K20 maximum flooding surface. And we go from low stand, transgressive systems tract, maximum flood to high stand. And the blue and green on these maps are mainly carbonates. So the dark grey means deep water in these intra-shelf basins. The dark blue means deep ramp or outer shelf carbonates. The medium blue represents shallower water carbonates, and the pale blue represents bands of high energy, very shallow water carbonate facies. And this is where you would expect most of the reservoir quality to be located. So we can use these maps to look at the regional stratigraphic trends of the facies belts. If you're looking at one small area and need to know what facies trend you're dealing with, you can use this to build in regional understanding of the trends of facies belts. The green represents peritidal facies. So these maps represent one third order sedimentary sequence that represents the Variacean Minigish oolite carbonate system. And the bands of oolites are developed around in the pale blue zone around the margins of the intra-shelf basin up against the onlap margin. This is the low stand at the start of the sedimentary sequence, where much of the only deposition took place in the intra-shelf basin, and much of the shelf areas were exposed. We have a transgression during the early to late Berriasian, and this is when the carbonate systems become nucleated around the basin margins, and you tend to get a backstepping of shallow water carbonates around the basin margin, which reaches its maximum during the maximum flooding surface. And then during the high stand, you get the progradation of the shallow water carbonate systems into the basin centre from the basin margins. And we can see here that we can constrain the distribution of the potential reservoir potential within the Minigish carbonate systems. So these are a couple of diagrams showing a cross-section roughly west-east across these carbonate systems. This is from northern Iraq. This is from southern Iraq, Kuwait area, and it shows that the main reservoir quality is located at the shallow part of the carbonate system, where the carbonate where the high energy facies impinges on the carbonate ramp profile. And you can see that these are stacked up. So the sequence of maps there just represents the K20 sequence, and this shows how these reservoir systems stack up from the K10 sedimentary sequence, K20, K30, and these distributions can be mapped throughout these separate sedimentary sequences. In a bit more detail, you can see that the Minigish oolites stack up into these progradational packages, each of which represents one of these third order sedimentary cycles. So we've got the best reservoir quality located at the top and of each sedimentary package. In more detail, the reservoir facies in the Minigish consist of these high energy oolite grainstones, often cross-bedded, so very high energy tidal facies, similar to what you get around the Bahamas at the moment, cross-bedded, some burrowing in lower energy, more offshore environments, and sometimes cut by these tidal channels in which you get these more coarse bioclastic and oncolitic lag deposits deposited. And these are often punctuated by hard grounds and firm grounds. And this is an example of the reservoir quality you get in the Minigish oolite. Very nice, coarse, reasonably well sorted oolitic grainstone with good preservation of intergranular porosity, which has been prevented from compaction by this patchy syntaxial carbonate cement around various echinoderms. Okay, so I'll now go back to PowerPoint. Okay, the next case history I'm going to look at is I'm going to move up into the Aptian to look at the Schreiber Bab intra-shelf basin system. Before I do that, I should say that the Minigish carbonates are capped by an erosion surface which limits the reservoir distribution, and we can map the stratigraphic separation of the of this unconformity. And after that, we had the progradation of these major clastic systems into the area from the Arabian Plate, from the Arabian Shield. And after that, we had shut off of the clastic systems and then re-establishment of the Schreiber carbonate system over the area. And I want to look at the relationships between the carbonates of the Schreiber and the Bab intra-shelf basin. So we're going to go down to the UAE part of the Arabian Plate, looking at the Valanginian to Aptian part of the stratigraphy. This is the early Aptian high stand map to the K70 sedimentary sequence, and we find that this best expresses the distribution of the Valanginian, the Schreiber carbonates and equivalent intra-shelf basin. The Schreiber has been split into a lower Schreiber, which is basically a regional ramp deposit, and the upper part of the Schreiber has been split into several cycles, and these tend to form a more shelf-like margin surrounding the intra-shelf basin that's the Bab basin. So again, the very pale blue is these rudist grainstone and rudist build-up facies that form the main reservoir potential around the margins of the intra-shelf basin, passing down dip into the darker blues of these waxstones, mudstones, and then into the grey of the argillaceous mudstone of the Bab basin, where we have preservation of organic matter, and this is a prolific source rock within the area. Okay, if we look at in a bit more detail now, if we zoom in onto the Bab basin, and as I cycle through the slides, I suggest you keep your eye on this part of the map, because I'll be showing you the transgression, maximum flood and high stand of this sedimentary sequence, and you can see how it's possible to sort of map these subtly changing morphology of the margins of the Bab basin. This map from Pearson 2010 covers approximately this area here, and this shows in a bit more detail than we're able to show. We're expressing things at a third order systems tracts level, and these third order systems tracts are made of higher order cycles, and these can be mapped in great detail on seismic, and these particularly the more detailed higher order cyclicity involved in the progradation of the margins of the Bab basin can be shown nicely on seismic. During the transgressive systems tract, we find the carbonate systems are more of a ramp-like morphology, with the shallowest part of the system being intertidal carbonates with some shallow lagoonal muds and some carbonate sands, presumably forming beach deposits or shallow shore face deposits. These are fringing the highs surrounding the basin. And then we pass into a more ramp-like profile where we have a deeper mid-ramp waxstone, packstone deposited below fair-weather wave base and containing some algal and rudist patch roofs. And then we pass down dip below storm wave base into the intra-shelf carbonate muds in the Bab basin itself. So just quickly go back there. This is the transgressive systems tract, and the next map I'll show you is the maximum flood. So sea level's risen, and you can see the Bab basin has expanded slightly with backstepping carbonate systems surrounding it. Then during the high stand of the same sedimentary sequence, we see the Bab basin's narrowed because the carbonate systems surrounding the Bab basin have prograded in, and we have a slightly different carbonate profile during these high stands, which is more of a shelf-like profile. The inner The shallow water facies association consists of algal and rudist patch reefs and shoals reworked from these patch reefs. And then we go into a lower energy, shallow marine, more sheltered shelf interior depositional setting with wax stones, carbonate mudstones, with rudist mound complexes and bioclastic sediments reworked from the bioherms, concentrated at around the shelf margin. And these pass outwards into the intra-shelf basin muds of the Bab Basin. Now, I mentioned that the details of the evolution of the carbonate systems surrounding the Bab Basin and within the Bab Basin can be nicely imaged on seismic. And this is a publication from USA et al. 2010. And it shows very nicely the sort of much higher order response of carbonate system than what we can capture on the paleogeographic maps, which are third order level. This is a time slice from the top, near top Schreiber Reservoir in the Buhassa field. We can see nicely a passage from cliniforms into the Bab Basin, across the platform interior and across the basin the other side. And we can see the platform interior facies imaged in this part of the diagram, and these features within the platform interior could be patch reefs. Then as we pass to the platform margin, we see these lineations, which are the strike of cliniforms, progradational cliniforms that are building out into the Bab Basin. So we've got a section through the top of the cliniforms there. And we can look at these in amplitude anomalies. This is the eastern margin of the Bab Basin. And we can see amplitude anomalies along the crests of these cliniforms, which could possibly be related to the development of carbonate shoals at the shelf margin. And it may be a reflection of varying reservoir quality along the margins of the basin. We also see changing geometries of the carbonate platforms. The Aptian sequences 2 to 4 show evidence of early aggradation. So they are, at the same time as they're building out into the Bab Basin, they're also stacking up vertically. Now, during deposition of Aptian sequence 5, there's a sea level low stand, so that drops. The sea level drops, and we have exposure of the carbonate platform surrounding the Bab Basin, but the carbonate depositional system moves out into the shallow water, which is now located further out in the basement. So we get these development of these progradational carbonate systems, shallow water systems, out into the Bab Basin. Okay, I now want to move up stratigraphy again. We have another major supersequence boundary, late Aptian unconformity. And then we have another episode of clastic progradation generated from the Arabian Shield. And we then get back into a more carbonate dominated succession throughout the Albian and the Cenomanian. And I want to look at one of these, the carbonate reservoir in a mixed-clastic carbonate sequence, which will be the Mauddud of mid to late Albian age. And we'll be looking at the K110 flooding surface and the associated sedimentary sequence. So I will again quit from PowerPoint and go into Stratbox. This is a publication we did on the Mauddud reservoir of the Burgan field in Kuwait. To explain the symbology on the maps, the orange, the browny orange area represent marginal marine to continental clastics. The bright yellow represents shallow marine clastic systems, and the yellow, the pale yellow represents deep marine clastics, and the dark brown here represents the deep water clastics. So this map represents the low stand to the sedimentary sequence containing the K110 maximum flooding surface. And during low stands, you get incision of the hinterland and progradation of clastic systems into the fringing carbonate area. And this is a series of prodeltaic and shallow marine clastic systems. This is the transgressive system tracked to the sedimentary sequence containing the K110 maximum flooding surface. And we see that the clastic systems are now beginning to backstep, and we're getting an expansion of carbonate deposition on the distal part of the plate away from the exposed plastic systems. And then if we continue to the high stand, the carbonate systems can spread back over the exposed Arabian plate previously covered by these distal clastic systems. So that we get, during the high stand, we get a drowning of the carbonate, drowning of the clastic source, and establishment of carbonate deposition over the area. So this represents a core log through the Mauddud plastic and carbonate reservoir of the Burgan field in Kuwait here. And the lower part of the core log represents the low stand to transgressive systems tract of the K1110 sedimentary sequence, and the upper carbonate part represents the early Albian high stand of this sedimentary sequence. And then above that, you go back into the shallow marine to distal marine clastics. These carbonates are exposed at the sequence boundary above at the top of the Mauddud carbonate, and we can see there's quite an ornate topography developed on the top of the carbonates here that are infilled with this later clastic, shallow marine clastic sediment. And also these sediments infill various karstic features within the top of the limestone, and the reservoir is quite a complex development of the initial depositional facies, depositional pore systems with superimposed karst cavities represented by dissolved fractures and vugs formed by karstic dissolution, which are themselves infilled by reasonably good reservoir quality sandstones. So the Mauddud carbonate and clastic member of the Burgan field is actually quite a complex, very thin reservoir with a variety of pore systems within it, because it's situated in this very marginal depositional setting at the margins of the Albian transgression, where it's sort of alternately receiving clastics during the low stand and transgressive systems tracts and development of carbonate set production during the high stands. Okay, let me now move on to the move back to the PowerPoint. So the next case history I want to look at is firstly the Mishrif carbonates, and then I want to look at the effects of one of these major unconformities associated with one of these major sequence boundaries. And this unconformity actually cuts down through the Mishrif, and it affects reservoir quality in the Mishrif in two ways. Firstly, the actual distribution of the Mishrif, and secondly, there are some diagenetic consequences caused during exposure, some good, some bad. So starting off with the Mishrif formation, which is Cenomanian. This is our high stand map for the main middle Cenomanian, which is the associated with the K132 flooding surface. We have a large expanse of carbonate platform sedimentation, some very shallow water facies, but mainly located over structural highs within the Arabian Plate, fringed by higher energy facies that separate the platforms from the intra-shelf basins. The main carbonate reservoir facies are located at the shelf margins and consist of rudist and grainstone sand bodies dominated by rudist debris. There is some local structural control on the orientation of the shelf margins, and the Mauddud, the Mishrif reservoir is commonly open primary porosity with not really too much diagenetic modifications. That's true in Iraq, where there's been not much in the way of not much effect of the post-Mishrif unconformity. But lower down in the Gulf, these carbonate systems get quite severely eroded, particularly around the margins of the intra-shelf basin and the Shalif intra-shelf basin, that is, and also the effects of, we also begin to see the effects of reservoir control, the effects of karstic exposure on reservoir quality, which, as I will mention, is variable. So in Iraq, we have this major carbonate platform sitting between two basins. To the northeast, we have the Balambo-Garau basin, which is an open marine basin because that is exposed to the continental margin. You can't actually see the continental margin because it's somewhere underneath the Zagros at this time. And to the southeast of the carbonate platform, you have the Najaf intra-shelf basin. And this is much more restricted than the Balambo-Garau basin because this is up against the Arabian shield, and in some cases during low stands, this basin gets desiccated with the formation of evaporites and associated karstic exposure of the carbonate platform and the Mishrif carbonates. Basically, the carbonate platform is built up of rudist buildups and associated reworked rudist debris around the shelf margin. There's platform interior facies with lower energy facies where the platform is much wider. You tend to get much lower energy conditions over the platform interior, and sometimes you get these peritidal facies developed in green. So that's the story in Iraq. If we go to the southern end of the Gulf, we see very similar sedimentary systems fringing the western margin of the Shalif basin. And we often see the section through the Mishrif here is often complete and shows lateral progradation into the basin. But along the eastern margin of the Shelif Basin, the Mishrif is strongly modified by erosion, and some of the upper beds, including the reservoir facies, have often been removed by erosion. So I want now to have a look in a bit more detail at the top Mishrif unconformity, which means going back to Stratbox. So this is a compilation published by Kathy Hollis et al., where she looked at the stratigraphic separation associated with the top Mishrif unconformity, and we can see that it cuts down progressively into the K120 sedimentary sequence. So there's the amount of stratigraphy missing associated with this unconformity is very variable. And if we look at the paleogeographic maps, this is for the K130 maximum flood and the K135 maximum flood. So we're looking at about this level in the diagram here. This is a high stand associated with the K130 maximum flooding surface, where we have development of very shallow water carbonate platforms around the Arabian Shield, with these rudist build-up facies associated with the shelf margins. And we begin to see this large hole appearing in the stratigraphy, which is what we'd expect to be associated with the top Mishrif unconformity. This is the low stand subsequent to this map. And again, we see a lot of non-deposition, because as well as the effects of this top Mishrif unconformity, we've got exposure of the carbonate platforms in the area. And we can see the effects of the top Mishrif unconformity kicking in again as we go further up the sedimentary succession. This is the transgressive systems tract of the K135 maximum flooding surface. And we can see there's quite a large area eroded down to this level from the top Mishrif unconformity, and particularly we have the reservoir facies. These are the rudist build-up facies associated with the margins of the Shelif Basin that have been completely eroded in the along the eastern margin of the basin. And then we go back to the maximum flood and the high stand of the K135 associated with the K135 maximum flooding surface. And again, we see the very similar pattern, slightly less stratigraphic separation here because we're gradually moving up succession, but still major erosion of reservoir facies around the Bab Basin. I mentioned that the unconformity has some effect on porosity. Sometimes the unconformity is beneficial because it causes leaching and development of or improvement of primary porosity with the development of Mauddud porosity. And sometimes you get a recrystallization with the production of low porosity, low permeability limestones associated with meteoric water during exposure associated with the top Mishrif unconformity. Okay, I'll quit out of Stratbox again and go back into PowerPoint. So I want to finish off the webinar now just by giving you a brief summary of the late Cretaceous carbonate and clastic systems. This is an isopack map of the Upper Cretaceous. Depositionals, deeper centres are most evident along the northeast margin, very similar to before, thinning to the southwest. we again see evidence of isopachs being controlled by these north-south structures inherited from the underlying basement. Here we have the Qatar Arch, the Gawa Arch, and the Burgan High in Kuwait. So supersequence 5, this is the one that commences with the regional unconformity, the top Mishrif unconformity we've just talked about. The Turonian is very, very localized in intra-shelf basin, with deposition largely in these intra-shelf basins to start with, and reflooding of the emergent areas commences in the later Turonian, particularly around the northern margin, northern part of the plate. There is a major structuration during the coniation with the development of high relief north-south paleohighs, and this is associated with the onset of rift development, possibly with a strike-slip component, because this reflects intra-shelf intraplate stresses that are brought about by the onset of compression. So this really is the onset of the changeover of the Arabian plate from a passive continental margin to a convergent continental margin. Elevated areas were onlapped by the Santonian to Campanian times, creating these very extensive carbonate platforms along the Arabian Shield side of the Arabian plate. So at this time, some reservoir facies are present and some source and seal facies are also present, but these tend to be fairly complex and fairly localized. Moving up into the next super sequence, Campanian age, we begin to see significant tectonism during sedimentation. This is due to the onset of ophiolite abduction along the Zagros margin. And also we begin to see the development of transtensional basins, sometimes as much as 2 kilometers deep. And because we get this structural growth along the convergent margin, we also see some carbonate platform facies developed on the Arabian side of the plate here. And so we get these systems developing over areas of structural growth along the margin, as well as these extensive carbonate systems that onlap the Arabian Shield. And also we see very deep water miles within the basin center, and we typically get very, very condensed deposition towards the end of the Cretaceous. Late Campanian, Maastrichtian, we really begin to get the effects of convergence and plate collision kicking in, because we begin to see clastic systems shed off the collisional margin coming in, particularly in the northern part of Iraq. Some of these are up to 2 kilometers thick. And then we also see low stand platform systems within basin systems in northern Iraq and Syria. What happens during high stands is that the platforms, carbonate platforms onlapping the Arabian plates, the Arabian Shield, are submerged and undergoing carbonate production. And when the when sea level drops, the carbonate system shifts out into the deeper parts of the basin and establishes limited shallow water carbonate platform systems over these margins during the low stand. And these, in certain parts of the northern Arabian plate, are form very, very good reservoirs. And then later on, you get onset of regional deep water pelagic sedimentation, and those form the reservoirs of the fractured carbonate systems in northern Iraq. Also, in these intra-shelf basins, now we're getting the connection with the open marine area very much restricted. Evaporites tend to occur in low stand and transgressive systems tracts within the intra-shelf basinal areas, which are now becoming locally cut off from the sea. So that gives you a brief introduction to the some of the petroleum systems on the Arabian Plate during the Cretaceous, and I'm going to be expanding on these case histories and giving you other case histories when I'll be presenting with Image Reality a workshop over 5 half days from the 29th of January to the 2nd of February. This will be a remote workshop using Stratbox as a presentation and training tool. And if you're interested, further information can be obtained from the Cambridge Carbonates and Image Reality websites. So thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I can either answer them now, or I'll come back to them if you'd like to email me. Over to you, Gabriella.
Thank you, Peter, for that very interesting overview. There aren't any specific questions that I can see there. I have seen another one come in, though, which is this, Peter, if you could you please explain again how the paleogeographical maps are constructed? Okay,
thank you. The first thing we need is a robust sequence stratigraphic framework so that we know we can confidently correlate all the maximum flooding surfaces across the plate. And this work started in the 1990s in northern Iraq, and eventually extending to the all of Iraq. And this led to a publication of the Arabian Plate sequence stratigraphy volume. For each third order sequence, we've split this into low stand, transgressive, maximum flood, and high stand maps. And we've built in facies maps. So these are all mapped from published data, including wells, outcrops, constrained by seismic lines, as much public data as we can get our hands on. And since the publication of the Arabian Plate sequence stratigraphy book in 2001, we have refined the system, kept account of publications that have been coming out in the 2 decades since then, and also refining our interpretation. So we've got we've identified far more sequences than what were originally described in the 2001 book. And as I mentioned, I've been talking about the Cretaceous now, but we also have these maps for the entire Phanerozoic. And I would also mention that another publication came out of this, which is the 2010 book, Petroleum Geology of Iraq. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for that. I don't see any other questions or comments coming in right now. But as Peter has suggested, there is the opportunity of getting in touch with him with some further questions, or you could perhaps still post them in the LinkedIn section of comments there where we've posted the webinar information. So there's still opportunities to ask questions and follow up with Peter afterwards. It just remains for me to thank you, Peter, for your time and for that session today. Thank you to everybody who is attending or who might then watch it at a later date, watch the recording at a later date. I hope you have a rest of a great day. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.